or something their spouse would do for them, except they're using their immigration status to keep them in bondage and in a cycle of violence. And then we also, we do two other things. We have unaccompanied minors. This has been a really growing phenomenon here in the United States, particularly in North Texas. Thousands of Central American teenagers fleeing the gang violence in Honduras and El Salvador, and they show up here unaccompanied, and we help them, those kids escaping really some really terrible human rights violations in their home country. And then we have a human rights curriculum where we go into high schools and we talk about human rights, and based around the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have found, and that's what's great about a program like this, and the program you're doing these 2 days, it's very difficult for schools to know how to introduce human rights into the curriculum, and so it's a great resource to be able to help teachers do that. I'll talk about the process of asylum. It's really interesting. You know, here we are right in the middle of comprehensive immigration reform, and I'll just ask a show of hands. How many of you have heard any mention of asylum seekers in the context of comprehensive immigration reform? It's barely talked about at all, which is really too bad because it's such a compelling area of law. And no matter what people think generally about immigration reform, I meet very, very few people who don't believe that America should be a place of refuge for people who are fleeing human rights abuses. So to win asylum, you have to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution because of one of 5 reasons, and this is really important. You have to show that you have a fear of persecution because of your race, religion, nationality, social class, or political opinion. So if you're someone who's suffered violence in your home country, but it's not for one of those 5 reasons, you are not entitled to asylum. So we see, for instance, people fleeing civil. We've seen a lot of people coming, for instance, from the civil war in Syria. They're coming out of chaos. They may have lost family members to violence, maybe threatened themselves. But unless that threat is directed to them because of their race, religion, or political opinion, then they're not going to be successful in an asylum application. Now, the process itself, there's really 2 ways to get asylum. One's called an affirmative application, which you fill out what's called a Form I-589, which is a very detailed form which tells someone's entire life story, and particularly in great detail the things that happened to them. They then go to an interview with an asylum officer here. The asylum seekers go to Houston, and they go to a relatively, usually non-adversarial interview with an asylum officer, and they can be granted asylum at that time. They bring with them whatever documents they might have, photographs of their injuries, maybe a medical report, maybe they have an arrest warrant, some documentation evidencing the things that happened to them. We happen to have the ill luck here. The Houston Asylum Office has one of the lowest grant rates of asylum in the United States. And so the vast majority of people who go to Houston are referred to immigration court, which is the other way that you can get asylum here in the United States. And it's called a defensive case. And that is an actual trial in front of an immigration judge. And it is adversarial. The government's represented by a lawyer. They cross-examine your client. It's a very vigorous process to test your clients. Most of these cases boil down to credibility issues, and if the immigration judge believes, well, number one, we have a very rigid intake process at HRI. We do not take a case. We only take a case if it meets 2 criteria. Number one, we believe the client's story, and number 2, if that story is true, they're entitled to relief under the law. So really, in our view, everybody we represent is somebody that is a legitimate asylum seeker. And our statistics are actually quite good. We win about 80–90% of our cases. That fluctuates though, and I'll be honest with you, I don't much like measuring our success by statistics, because I want us to take hard cases and I want us to not skew the deck with just easy cases, although frankly there aren't really anything there's really no easy case in this region. So we have very high statistics. The national rate of grant for asylum seekers is about 56%. One of the local judges denies 90% of the cases that go in front of his court. Although I have to say, just this week we won asylum for a young man from Nigeria. So that was a good day. I won't take the next 2 minutes. I'll just say thank you.
Okay. First of all, let me apologize for two things. This is a building that was built in 1903, thus the pillar, and the giant doors and all of that. And I can tell you that the first day I ever walked in here and I heard the dart going by and I was going through the exhibit, I assumed that was pre-recorded noise of Jews on trains being taken away. And it wasn't until I heard it like 6 or 7 times that I realized, no, in fact, that's the dart rail. So we have to talk over that. Okay, Dionna or Dion?
Dionna.
Dionna, okay. Dionna, I have a couple of questions for you. The first question is, in addition to your work as an associate for a prominent law firm here in town, you serve as a pro bono lawyer in asylum cases. And I was hoping you could describe one or two of the most compelling or challenging human rights cases you've worked. And additionally, if you could weave into that, what compels you to do this work?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with talking about the cases that I was fortunate enough to work on. The Human Rights Initiative came to my law firm and did a presentation about the work that they do. And as a result of that, I got involved with 2 different asylum cases.
Dionna, could you stand up or talk to me?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll
Sorry.
stand, I guess. So as a result of that, I got involved in 2 different asylum cases. The first was a woman from Egypt. She is a Coptic Christian. As a child, she was subjected to female genital mutilation. And as an adult, she was kidnapped and sexually and physically assaulted because of her religion. When we first took that case, I wasn't aware that female genital mutilation, or FGM, was so common in Egypt. About 90% of women have the procedure done when they're kids, and it's not really performed based on religious affiliation. It's more of at the time at least, it was more of a culture thing. Although both the Coptic Christian Church and Islam have backed off from the practice and condemned it. But also, before taking this case, I didn't realize how horrific it really was. It affected her life then. It was a traumatic experience then, and it continues to be. She is in pain every time she's intimate with her husband. She said she cries and has to bite onto the pillow still, and she's in her 40s. And so that happened when she was a kid. And growing up in Egypt, it's very difficult to be. It was very difficult to be a Coptic Christian, even under Mubarak, who was the prior president. But when Mubarak was ousted, Morsi came into power, and he was backed by the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm sure you've heard some of that in the news. And when that happened, things were destabilized, and radical Islamic groups took that out as an opportunity to further harass the Coptic Christian population. Copts, I think, are about 7% of the population in Egypt, and they experience discrimination and harassment, but also the women don't tend to cover their hair and will experience harassment on the street. My client's daughter had her hair pulled and she was followed in the streets. My client was followed in the streets and continually harassed that she needed to cover her hair or something bad will happen, and eventually it did. She was walking from her mother's house, and a car pulled up beside her, and they pulled her in, and they sexually assaulted and physically assaulted her. And the only way, and at some point they slowed down, and she sort of heroically decided that that was her moment and jumped out of the car, and was rescued on the streets by people who passed by. But as a result of her escape, she ended up losing her unborn child. So after that experience, she already had a visitor visa to the U.S. and fled and made her way to the Human Rights Initiative, and we took her case. Ultimately, after a lot of setbacks, we were able to get asylum for her, and it was just one of the most beautiful days of my life. So she is well. She's in the States now, and she's petitioned for her family, her husband and son, who she hasn't seen for about 2 years, to come over from Egypt, and she's hopeful that that'll happen sooner rather than later, because as I'm sure you know, things aren't that great in Egypt right now. My second case was a gentleman from Eritrea, which is in East Africa, and he, it's a very it's a country with very repressive laws. They've had the same president since 1993. They're very suspicious of foreigners. They think they're spies, and they're very suspicious of citizens who interact with foreigners because they think that they're helping these outside influences, get access to country secrets. So our client was involved with a couple of international NGOs, and one of them was a sports team. And what happens a lot of times is athletes from Eritrea will get to leave the country as a result of, competition. And when they leave, they'll flee because they don't want to go back. Because when they go back, they're subject to arbitrary detention and torture and the like, and compulsory military service. So they'll flee. Well, he had volunteered with this sports team, and after they fled, they wanted to know what happened to them, where they went, and they thought that my client knew that. So one day after work, the car pulls up beside him and takes him, and he is imprisoned for almost a year. During that time, his first night upon arriving, they beat him immediately until he was unconscious, and he woke up, and it may have been days later, he doesn't know. He was starved, he was beaten almost every day. They didn't have facilities where they kept the prisoners. Sorry, I don't want to use up too much time.
No,
but,
you're fine.
They didn't have facilities, so it smelled of urine and defecation. And if you wanted to leave to use the facilities, they would beat you along the way there and beat you back. Almost every day, he was tortured and forced to hold certain positions for up to 4 hours at a time in the hot Eritrean sun. And he said it felt like his chest muscles were pulling apart and his shoulders were dislocating for up to 4 hours. Also miraculously, one day they were transporting them from one hard labor site to another, and he says that he felt God tell him that this was his moment, and that if he didn't try and escape now, he wasn't going to survive. So he was in a truck, and he rolled out of the truck and went running into the woods, and as he was running, the guards shot at him, but he made it, and he hid in those woods throughout the entire night, and eventually found his way to a friend's house, and found his way through 10 different countries, eventually made it to the U.S. and to the Human Rights Initiative, where we got his case, and he also was granted asylum, and that was also one of the best days of my life. He is a wonderful person, both of my clients are, and what compels me to do the work, what will compel me to do the work going forward, is just having gone through it as a lawyer who used to work for a judge. It is such a complicated process, and even though both of their stories are extraordinarily compelling, and clearly they're entitled to asylum, if they did not have representation, they wouldn't have been granted asylum. And my client from Egypt would never see her son or husband again. And so that's why I think it's so important that the Human Rights Initiative provides the service that they do. What compelled me to do the work in the first place was just, I've always been interested in civil rights and human rights work. I did some study abroad and traveling when I was in school. And happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Next we have Robert, and I have a number of questions for you. I wanted you first to please briefly discuss the human rights violations that you witnessed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the other part of this is an opinion question, which is, in your opinion, why does the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you can probably write this larger to other areas, but tolerate and even engage in human rights abuses? And I'm using DRC as a stand-in for the government, for the military, not for random citizens. And then the next question I would ask is, knowing the risks, and you dealt with them very, very tangibly, why do you think people continue to be human rights activists in places like the Congo? And finally, what was it like for you to obtain asylum here in America? And that part, if we carry over, we can carry over to the question and answer period. But I'm assuming that like me, most of you don't know what it's like to pick up and leave everything you've ever known and loved and go someplace where you don't necessarily speak the language, where you don't know the culture, you don't know the legal system, you know nothing about it. So.
Yeah, I'm Robert Fala. I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I have my accent in my English is gonna be a little easier for you to understand exactly what's going on in my country. I'm a lawyer, and I've been a lawyer in 2005, working in a small law firm doing my private practice, and I was really, really shocked by the human rights abuses in my country, especially where I grew up in northeast of Congo. In 2003, there was a kind of a fight of militia in the villages where people were using machetes, kill others, and women were raped.